The city of Griffin, Georgia, sits approximately 40 miles south of Atlanta, a distance that places it just outside the sprawling, frantic energy of the metropolis, but close enough to feel its gravitational pull. It is a community where tradition commands respect, and few traditions hold as much sway as high school football. In this part of Spalding County, the gridiron is not merely a patch of grass for athletic contest. It is a civic altar. The final Saturday of September in 2023 marked a date circled on thousands of calendars across the region. It was the scheduled collision between the Griffin High School Bears and the Spalding High School Jaguars. This was not just a game, it was the rivalry. The history between the two schools runs deep, dividing the town along loyalties that span generations. Families are often split by alumni status, and local businesses decorate their windows in competing colors. On September 30, the atmosphere inside Griffin Memorial Stadium was electric, charged with the specific humidity of a Georgia autumn and the roaring noise of a capacity crowd. The stadium lights hummed against the darkening sky, illuminating the verdant field where teenage athletes pushed themselves to the limit for the honor of their respective institutions. For the thousands in attendance, the night was supposed to be a celebration of community identity, a release of tension through sport. Among the throngs of spectators was 14-year-old Emmanuel Dorsey. At 14, Emmanuel stood on the precipice of young adulthood, a time defined by rapid changes and widening horizons. Those who knew him described a boy with a gentle spirit, a teenager who navigated the often turbulent waters of adolescence with a quiet grace. He was not looking for trouble. He was not a participant in the street-level friction that occasionally bubbled beneath the surface of the city's social fabric. Emmanuel was there for the football. He was there to socialize with friends, to laugh in the stands, and to witness the spectacle of the biggest game of the year. Emmanuel's path that evening was one of innocence. It was the path of a student engaging in the quintessential American high school experience. He walked through the stadium gates with the expectation of safety that every child is owed. His concerns were likely the trivial, heavy matters of a 14-year-old, the score of the game, the jokes shared among peers, the plans for the rest of the weekend. He represented the potential of Griffin's youth, a life unwritten and full of possibility. He wore the colors of his community and cheered alongside neighbors, oblivious to the machinery of violence that was silently winding its gears nearby. Converging on the same location was 17-year-old Kyomarion LaShawn Kendrick. While Emmanuel Dorsey's evening was defined by the camaraderie of the stands, Kyomarion Kendrick's night was dictated by a darker, more predatory agenda. At 17, Kendrick was only 3 years older than Emmanuel, yet he inhabited a vastly different psychological landscape. Kendrick's presence at Griffin Memorial Stadium was not driven by school spirit or a love of the sport. He arrived, carrying the baggage of external conflicts, rivalries that had nothing to do with touchdowns or field goals, and everything to do with respect, territory, and perceived slights between cliques. Kendrick's path was one of escalation. By the time he arrived at the stadium, he had already made a series of decisions that severed him from the realm of normal teenage rebellion. The most critical of these decisions was concealed on his person. Kendrick was armed. He was not merely carrying a firearm for protection in a rough environment. He was carrying a weapon modified for catastrophic destruction. The firearm in his possession was a Glock pistol, but it had been altered with an illegal aftermarket device known on the streets as a switch. The mechanics of the switch are simple but devastating. A standard semi-automatic pistol requires one pull of the trigger for each round fired. It is a weapon of precision. The installation of a switch bypasses this mechanism, converting the handgun into a fully automatic machine pistol capable of emptying an extended magazine in seconds. This modification changes the nature of the weapon from a tool of defense or targeted aggression into an instrument of indiscriminate suppression. When a shooter depresses the trigger of a switched Glock, the recoil is immense, the rate of fire is uncontrollable, and the trajectory of the bullets becomes erratic. It is a weapon designed for war, not for a dispute in a crowded public venue. Kendrick brought this capability into a space filled with families, children, and students. His mindset, later scrutinized through the lens of the judicial system, showed a disregard for the sanctity of the environment he was entering. While Emmanuel Dorsey watched the plays unfold on the field, Kendrick moved through the periphery, his attention tuned to the frequencies of conflict. He was allegedly associated with a group that had ongoing tensions with individuals from the opposing side of town. The football game served as a convenient nexus, a place where targets might present themselves. The juxtaposition of these two teenagers highlights the tragic duality often found in stories of youth violence. On one side stood Emmanuel Dorsey, a boy doing exactly what a boy should do on a Saturday night in Georgia. He was unarmed, uninvolved in gang politics, and surrounded by the supposed security of a school-sanctioned event. On the other side stood Marion Kendrick, a young man who had embraced a lifestyle where lethal force was a first resort. The distance between them was physical, measured in yards within the stadium complex, but philosophically, they existed in different worlds. One lived in a world of homework and sports, the other had entered a world of ballistics and retribution. As the game progressed, the energy in the stadium began to shift. The intense rivalry on the field was mirrored by growing agitation in certain sections of the crowd. Security personnel and school administrators were present, patrolling the fence lines and the bleachers, aware that passions could flare. However, the sheer volume of attendees made total surveillance impossible. In the pockets of shadow beneath the grandstands and near the concession areas, the friction between rival cliques began to generate heat. Words were exchanged. Postures were hardened. The signals of impending violence were broadcasting, but they were largely drowned out by the roar of the game. Marion Kendrick moved with intent. The presence of the modified weapon emboldened a sense of power. In the logic of the street, the switch provided a trump card, a guarantee of dominance in any physical altercation. It also acted as a blinder, narrowing the user's focus to the immediate destruction of an enemy while obscuring the collateral damage that such a weapon inevitably causes. Kendrick was not preparing for a fistfight. He was preparing for an ambush. The disconnect between the 17-year-old's perception of reality and the actual moral weight of his actions would later become a focal point of the legal proceedings. The divergent paths of Dorsey and Kendrick were destined to intersect not in the stands, but in the chaotic exodus that followed the game. As the clock wound down and the final whistle blew, the stadium began to purge its occupants. Thousands of people streamed toward the exits, creating a bottleneck of humanity. The mixture of victors and defeated, of adrenaline and exhaustion, created a volatile chemical mix. It was in this fluid, shifting crowd that the protective bubble around Emmanuel Dorsey began to thin and the threat posed by Marion Kendrick began to materialize. The geography of the stadium exit played a crucial role in the unfolding disaster. The crowds were funneled into specific lanes, reducing the ability to maneuver or escape. For a predator seeking a confrontation, the congestion provided cover. For a victim, it removed the option of flight. Emmanuel moved with the flow of the students, likely discussing the game's outcome, his mind on the immediate future of getting home. He was a passive actor in the scene, a particle carried by the wave. Kendrick, conversely, was an active agent. He and his associates were scanning the crowd, looking for specific faces, looking for the spark that would justify the release of the violence they had brought with them. The tension that had simmered during the quarters of the game was now boiling over in the parking lots and walkways. Shout matches erupted. The density of the crowd meant that these skirmishes were not isolated. They rippled through the mass of people, creating panic and confusion. It is in this prelude to the shooting that the tragedy is most starkly defined. The system of school sports, designed to build character and community, had been infiltrated by a nihilistic code of conduct where respect is measured in caliber and capacity. Emmanuel Dorsey represented the promise of the institution. Marion Kendrick represented the failure of the social safety net and the intrusion of deadly serious criminality into the playground. The two boys were separated by 3 years in age, but an eternity in intent. One walked toward a ride home, the other walked toward a life sentence. As the crowds pushed against the fences and the night air filled with the sounds of shouting, the invisible timer on the encounter ticked down to 0. The grin that would later appear on Kendrick's mugshot was not yet visible, but the attitude that spawned it, a chilling indifference to human life, was already fully formed, resting heavy in his pocket, waiting for the slightest provocation to unleash a storm of lead into the unsuspecting crowd. The divergent paths had run out of ground. They were now occupying the same terrifying space. As the crowds pushed against the fences and filtered through the narrow egress points of Griffin Memorial Stadium, the atmosphere shifted from athletic competition to something far more volatile. The distinct humidity of a Georgia autumn night clung to the skin of thousands of spectators, a mixture of students, parents, and alumni who had gathered for one of the county's most storied rivalries. The game between Griffin High School and Spalding High School is never merely a sporting event. It is a civic ritual that draws the entire demographic spectrum of the city into a single, condensed geographical point. On the 30th of September 2023, however, the energy radiating from the bleachers was discordant. While the scoreboard had settled the athletic contest, a secondary unregulated competition was beginning to materialize in the shadows beyond the goalposts. The layout of the stadium contributed to the impending bottleneck. As the fourth quarter clock expired, a mass exodus began, forcing waves of people into the parking areas and the adjacent streets. The logistical reality of dismissing a capacity crowd created a chaotic environment where surveillance became nearly impossible. Uniformed officers were present, stationed to manage traffic and deter standard teenage misconduct. But the sheer volume of humanity provided a natural camouflage for those with darker intentions. Within this moving sea of green, gold, and blue, specific currents of hostility were forming, driven not by school pride, but by the jagged lines of neighborhood affiliations and street-level grievances. In the periphery of the celebrating families and departing bands, small clusters of young men began to coalesce. These were not the standard post-game congregations of students discussing plays or plans for late-night food. These groups moved with a distinct tactical awareness, scanning the crowd with focused intensity. Among them was 17-year-old Kyomarian Kendrick. He moved through the periphery of the stadium grounds, an environment that should have been a zone of safety for the community's youth. Kendrick, however, was not operating under the social contract of a high school spectator. He was navigating a battlefield of his own making, carrying a weapon that elevated the potential for destruction from a fistfight to a mass casualty event. Concealed on his person was a Glock pistol, but it was the modification attached to the firearm that altered the calculus of the night. The weapon was equipped with a switch, a small, illegal auto-sear device that bypasses the semi-automatic trigger mechanism, allowing the handgun to fire continuously like a machine gun. The presence of this device indicated a premeditation for overwhelming violence. A switch does not allow for precision. It is designed for volume and suppression. By bringing such a weapon to a crowded public venue, the intent was not merely self-defense or targeted aggression, but a willingness to unleash indiscriminate force. The existence of the switch transformed the parking lot from a place of transit into a potential kill zone. While Kendrick and his associates maneuvered through the thinning crowd, Emmanuel Dorsey was attempting to navigate the same space with entirely different objectives. At 14 years old, Dorsey was a freshman, a participant in the innocent rhythms of high school life. He had attended the game to support his school, to socialize, and to exist within the community. He was waiting for a ride, a mundane act performed by hundreds of other students at that exact moment. Dorsey stood near the stadium exit, surrounded by the noise of departing cars and the chatter of classmates. He was unarmed, unaware that the proximity of rival factions was about to collapse the safety of the environment. He was a bystander, in the truest sense, positioned at the intersection of a generic teenage experience and a targeted act of gang violence. The tension in the air was palpable to those tuned to the frequency of street conflict. Verbal exchanges began to spike above the ambient noise of the crowd. What started as posturing hard stares and hand signs exchanged across the asphalt rapidly escalated into direct confrontation. The catalyst was not a singular event, but an accumulation of perceived disrespects and long-standing feuds between the cliques present. The specific grievances were likely trivial in the grand scope of history, but in the heat of the moment, Amplified by the presence of an audience and the adrenaline of the game, they became absolute imperatives. Witnesses later described a shift in the crowd's movement. The natural flow toward the exits halted and began to swirl around a specific point of friction. A fight broke out. It was the kind of brawl common to high school rivalries, a flurry of fists and grappling bodies that typically ends with bruised egos and police intervention. However, the physical altercation acted as a smokescreen for the lethal escalation, occurring just meters away. The chaos of the brawl drew eyes and attention, pulling the focus of bystanders and security personnel toward the center of the disturbance. It created a vortex of confusion. Screams of excitement mixed with shouts of anger, making it difficult for anyone to discern the sudden appearance of a firearm until it was too late. Marion Kendrick was positioned near this eruption of violence. The dynamics of the brawl provided the cover he needed to act. The logic of the street, which governed his actions that night, dictated that a physical challenge by a rival group required a dominant response. In this distorted code of honor, the presence of the opposing faction was provocation enough. The crowd was no longer a collection of peers. It was an obstacle course and a backdrop. The 14-year-old Dorsey, standing nearby, was not a combatant in this specific feud, but he was within the geometric cone of danger that Kendrick was about to project. As the physical fight intensified, the separation between the combatants and the observers collapsed. The perimeter of the brawl expanded, swallowing up the space where students were waiting for parents. The blue lights of police cruisers flashed rhythmically against the stadium walls, a strobe light effect that illuminated the scene in disjointed bursts. Officers were shouting commands, attempting to push through the density of the crowd to separate the fighters. But the speed of the escalation outpaced the reaction time of law enforcement. The transition from shouting to shoving to lethal intent happened in the span of seconds. Kendrick's decision-making process in these critical moments was later dissected by investigators and the judiciary. He did not retreat from the chaos, he advanced toward it. The psychological threshold he crossed was the decision to introduce a fully automatic weapon into a fistfight involving minors. It was a decision that ignored the hundreds of potential collateral victims within the spray radius of the modified Glock. The presence of the switch meant that once the trigger was depressed, the weapon would empty its magazine in less than 2 seconds, sending a storm of lead into a chaotic mass of moving bodies. The noise of the crowd reached a crescendo. The excitement of the game had fully curdled into panic as the fight spilled over onto the pavement. People began to realize that the tenor of the violence had changed. The aggressive posturing had turned into a desperate scramble. Those closest to the center of the conflict could see the change in body language, the sudden clearing of space that often precedes gunplay. The air grew heavy with the specific metallic scent of impending violence. Emmanuel Dorsey remained in the vicinity, perhaps frozen by the sudden outbreak of the brawl, or simply unable to push through the wall of people behind him. He was a fixed point in a fluid situation. The tragedy of the buildup was the proximity of the two distinct worlds. The world of high school football, with its band uniforms and varsity jackets, and the world of the modified Glock, with its nihilistic disregard for life. These two worlds were about to collide with catastrophic force. Kendrick raised the weapon. The mechanical reality of the switch-equipped firearm meant there was no need to aim carefully, no need to select a specific target. The weapon was a tool of area denial. In the seconds before the firing began, the crowd was a singular entity, a living organism reacting to the stimulus of the fight. When the weapon appeared, the organism fractured. The collective gasp of those who saw the gun was swallowed by the immediate, deafening roar of automatic fire. The build-up to the murder of Emmanuel Dorsey was not a long, drawn-out conspiracy, but a rapid acceleration of teenage bravado fueled by military-grade firepower. It was the culmination of a culture that allowed a 17-year-old to walk the streets with the firepower of a squad automatic weapon and the tragic misfortune of a 14-year-old boy who simply wanted to see a football game. The grin that would later appear on Kendrick's face in his mugshot was born in this moment of power, the moment he decided that his desire to project dominance outweighed the lives of everyone standing on that pavement. The tension that had been building since the kickoff, the rivalries that had simmered in the neighborhoods of Griffin, and the specific mechanics of a modified polymer pistol all converged on a single point in time, shattering the peace of the post-game night and sealing the fates of both the shooter and the victim. The time for de-escalation had passed. The time for tragedy had arrived. The moment Marion Kendrick reached into his waistband, the atmosphere on South 5th Street shifted irrevocably from high school rivalry to urban warfare. It was shortly after the final whistle had blown at the Griffin Memorial Stadium, marking the end of the annual contest between Griffin High School and Spalding High School. The game itself, a staple of the local community calendar, had drawn hundreds of spectators, a mix of families, alumni, and teenagers, eager to capitalize on the Friday night freedom. The energy was electric, charged with the natural adrenaline of competitive sports, but as the throngs of students poured out of the stadium gates and onto the surrounding streets, that electricity curdled into tension. The epicenter of this shift was a growing congregation of youths near the intersection of South 5th Street. While the majority of the crowd was intent on finding rides home or heading to post-game celebrations, a specific subset of teenagers had different priorities. Intelligence gathered later by law enforcement indicated that this was not a spontaneous gathering of strangers, but a collision of known factions. Rival cliques, fueled by social media taunts and territorial posturing, had converged. The verbal sparring began almost immediately, a cacophony of shouts and challenges that rose above the idling engines of departing cars and the distant sound of the stadium announcements. Witnesses described the initial phase of the confrontation as a typical brawl. Fists were thrown, and the crowd tightened into a dense circle, a human ring created to watch the spectacle. In this chaotic scrum, individual identities blurred. It was a sea of hoodies, jerseys, and frantic movement. For a few minutes, the violence remained physical and contained, the kind of skirmish that often dissolves when police sirens draw near. However, the dynamics of this particular fight were dictated by the presence of Marion Kendrick and the weapon he had concealed against his person. Kendrick, 17 years old at the time, was not merely an observer. He was an active participant in the escalating hostility. The timeline of events accelerated rapidly as the physical altercation intensified. The shouting matches turned into shoving, and the shoving turned into swinging. It was in the midst of this deteriorating situation that the decision was made to escalate the conflict beyond physical blows. Kendrick did not produce a knife or a blunt object. He produced a modified Glock pistol. The weapon requires specific attention to understand the devastation that followed. Standard semi-automatic handguns fire one round for every pull of the trigger. This mechanical limitation allows for a degree of control and target acquisition. Kendrick's weapon, however, had been illegally modified with a distinct device known on the street as a switch. This small, often 3D, printed component alters the sear mechanism of the firearm, bypassing the semi-automatic restriction. With the switch engaged, a single depression of the trigger causes the weapon to cycle continuously until the magazine is empty or the trigger is released. It converts a handgun into a machine pistol, capable of emptying a standard magazine in just over 1 second. As Kendrick raised the weapon, the crowd was still tightly packed, their attention fixed on the fistfight. Most were unaware of the lethal threat that had just materialized. The distance between the shooter and the mass of students was negligible. There was no attempt to isolate a specific target, nor was there any hesitation. Kendrick fired into the crowd. The sound that erupted on South 5th Street was not the rhythmic pop-pop-pop of a standard shooting. It was a rapid, ripping noise, a continuous burst of gunfire that many witnesses initially mistook for firecrackers or a sudden mechanical failure of a vehicle. The rate of fire was so high that the individual shots were nearly indistinguishable. In the span of a heartbeat, the modified Glock spewed a stream of projectiles into the gathering. The physics of the shooting were indiscriminate. When a handgun is fired in full automatic mode without a stock or specialized training, the recoil is immense and difficult to control. The muzzle climbs rapidly, sending bullets in an unpredictable vertical arc. Kendrick, firing into a dynamic, moving crowd of teenagers, unleashed a spray of lead that had no regard for who stood in its path. The weapon simply did what it was modified to do, expel metal at a terrifying velocity until it ran dry. Chaos ensued instantly. The tight circle of spectators shattered as the realization of gunfire took hold. Screams replaced the jeers of the fight. The collective instinct for self-preservation triggered a stampede. Teenagers scrambled over one another, diving behind parked cars, sprinting toward the stadium walls, or throwing themselves onto the asphalt. The air was filled with the acrid smell of smokeless powder and the terrified shrieks of children. In the midst of this pandemonium, 14-year-old Emmanuel Dorsey was struck. Dorsey had not been a combatant in the brawl. He was, by all accounts, a spectator, a young student who had attended the game to support his school and enjoy the night. He was part of the backdrop of the evening, one of the hundreds of kids simply existing in the space. The bullet that found him did not discriminate based on intent or involvement. It struck him with fatal precision, dropping him to the pavement as the crowd surged around him in a panic-stricken wave. The brutality of the event was compounded by the speed at which it occurred. From the moment the first round was fired to the moment the gun clicked empty, only seconds had passed. Yet, in that brief window, the social contract of the community was severed. A place of celebration had been transformed into a crime scene. Kendrick, having emptied the weapon, did not remain to check on the casualties. He took advantage of the absolute bedlam he had created. As the echoes of the gunshots faded, replaced by the wailing of sirens approaching from the stadium perimeter, Kendrick moved. He blended into the scattering crowd, using the very chaos he had engineered as a cover for his escape. He fled the scene on South 5th Street, disappearing into the dark corridors of the surrounding neighborhood. He left behind a scene of utter devastation. First responders, who had been nearby for game security, descended on the location within moments. They were met with a scene that defied the context of a high school football game. Young people were hysterical, pointing in different directions, crying out names. The ground was littered with dropped cell phones, shoes lost in the stampede, and debris from the panic. But the focal point for the arriving officers was the figure of Emmanuel Dorsey. Paramedics and police officers attempted life-saving measures on the 14-year-old, battling against the trauma inflicted by the gunshot wound. The severity of the injury, however, was catastrophic. The violence of the act, a military rate-of-fire weapon discharged at close range into a soft target, left little room for medical intervention. The joy of the sporting event had been extinguished, replaced by the stark, clinical reality of homicide. The crime scene technicians who later arrived on South 5th Street had to map a chaotic geography of evidence. Shell casings were not found in neat groupings typical of a controlled shooter. They were scattered, ejected rapidly as the shooter moved or as the weapon recoiled. Each casing was a brass testament to the reckless disregard for human life that defined the encounter. Laser trajectories mapped later would show lines of fire that intersected the space where dozens of children had been standing just moments before. It was a matter of probability and tragic misfortune that Emmanuel Dorsey was the one who fell, but the act itself was an assault on everyone present. The shooting on South 5th Street was not a robbery gone wrong or a domestic dispute. It was a projection of power through superior firepower. Kendrick's decision to bring a machine pistol to a fistfight fundamentally altered the nature of the conflict. He introduced a level of lethality that the victims had no capacity to counter or anticipate. The spectators, including Dorsey, were expecting a teenage scrap. They were met with a barrage of gunfire that belonged on a battlefield. As the night wore on, the news rippled through the Griffin and Spalding communities. The flashing lights of the police cruisers illuminated the crime scene tape that now cordoned off the area where the fight had occurred. Inside that perimeter, the evidence of a life cut short remained. Outside the perimeter, the manhunt for the shooter began. The grin that would later define Kendrick's public image was not yet visible to the world, but the actions that warranted it had been completed. He had fired into the crowd, he had killed a child, and he had walked away into the shadows of the Georgia night, leaving a community to grapple with the horror of what had just unfolded on the pavement of South 5th Street. The flashing lights of the police cruisers illuminated the crime scene tape that now cordoned off the area where the fight had occurred, casting long, dancing shadows against the brick exterior of the stadium. While the chaotic exodus of students and parents had largely subsided, The work for the Griffin Police Department and the Spalding County Sheriff's Office was just beginning. The initial chaos of the shooting scene gave way to the meticulous, silent work of forensic recovery. Investigators moved through the parking lot in a grid pattern, placing small yellow markers next to the evidence left behind. The physical evidence told a terrifying story of the weaponry involved. Detectives located and marked 17 shell casings scattered across the pavement. The proximity of the casings to one another, combined with witness accounts describing the sound of the gunfire, pointed to a specific and highly dangerous modification. The shooter had not merely fired a handgun, he had utilized a modified Glock equipped with an autosear, commonly known on the streets as a switch. This small device, illegal under federal law, converted a standard semi-automatic pistol into a fully automatic machine gun, capable of emptying a 30-round magazine in roughly 2 seconds. The presence of such a weapon escalated the investigation immediately. This was not just a homicide. It was a deployment of military-grade firepower in a civilian zone populated by children. Identifying the suspect required sifting through a deluge of digital evidence. In the modern era of high school conflicts, the brawl that preceded the shooting had been well documented by dozens of smartphones. Investigators subpoenaed footage and scrubbed through social media platforms where videos of the fight were already circulating. The grainy clips showed the escalation of the rivalry, the movement of the crowd, and finally, the figure who stepped back and raised the weapon. Through the analysis of clothing, physical stature, and eyewitness corroboration, police identified the shooter as 17-year-old Keomarion LaShawn Kendrick. By the morning of October 1, warrants were secured for Kendrick's arrest. The charges were severe: malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a crime. However, securing a warrant and securing the suspect proved to be two vastly different challenges. Kendrick was gone. He had fled the scene immediately after the shooting, melting into the night while the crowd was still scattering in panic. The Griffin Police Department, led by Chief Mike Yates, and the Spalding County Sheriff's Office, under Sheriff Darrell Dix, initiated a massive manhunt. The search for Keomarion Kendrick paralyzed the community. For 8 days, the residents of Griffin and the surrounding areas lived in a state of heightened anxiety. The knowledge that a teenager with a fully automatic weapon was at large and had already demonstrated a willingness to fire into a crowd kept nerves frayed. Schools in the district operated under heightened security protocols. Parents hesitated to let their children play outside. The football rivalry that had been a source of local pride was now inextricably linked to a narrative of violence and fear. Law enforcement agencies cast a wide net. The U.S. Marshals Service was brought in to assist, leveraging their resources and expertise in tracking violent fugitives. The investigation turned into a digital and physical dragnet. Investigators monitored phone lines, tracked location data, and interviewed known associates of Kendrick. They pressured his social circle, making it clear that anyone aiding the fugitive would face serious legal consequences. The message was disseminated through press conferences and community channels. Kendrick was considered armed and extremely dangerous, and the patience of law enforcement was wearing thin. Intelligence gathering began to yield results as the week progressed. Patterns in communication and tips from the public suggested that Kendrick had left the immediate vicinity of Spalding County. He was not hiding in the woods or fleeing across state lines. Instead, he was relying on a network of acquaintances to keep him concealed in residential areas. The trail eventually pointed north, crossing the county line into neighboring Henry County. The breakthrough came on the morning of Sunday, the 8th of October 2023. Surveillance teams and electronic tracking pinpointed Kendrick's location to a residence in Henry County. The operation to apprehend him was planned with extreme caution. Given the suspect's possession of a machine gun and his prior disregard for collateral damage, a standard door knock was out of the question. A heavy tactical presence was assembled, comprised of units from the Henry County Sheriff's Office, the Griffin Police Department, and the Spalding County Sheriff's Office. The tactical team surrounded the residence, establishing a hard perimeter to prevent any chance of escape. Armored vehicles were positioned to provide cover for the officers. The silence of the Sunday morning was broken by the commands of the tactical team, ordering the occupants of the house to exit with their hands raised. The tension among the officers was palpable. They were prepared for a shootout, anticipating that a young man facing life in prison might choose not to be taken alive. However, the siege ended without a single shot fired. The pressure of the perimeter and the overwhelming show of force compelled a surrender. Marion Kendrick emerged from the residence. He was unarmed at the moment of his exit. Officers moved in swiftly, ordering him to the ground. The click of the handcuffs signaled the end of the 8-day manhunt, but the demeanor of the suspect in the moments that followed would become a defining image of the case. As deputies escorted Kendrick toward the waiting patrol vehicles, the gravity of the situation seemed to escape him completely. He was dressed in a dark hoodie, his hands cuffed behind his back, flanked by law enforcement officers in tactical gear. As he was led past the cameras and the gathered officers, Kendrick looked up. He did not hide his face. He did not show signs of remorse, fear, or exhaustion. Instead, he flashed a wide, unsettling grin. The image of that grin was captured in photographs and video, instantly circulating through the news media and online channels. To the investigators who had spent over a week hunting him, and to the family of Emmanuel Dorsey, who were preparing to bury a 14-year-old boy, the expression was a chilling display of detachment. It suggested a total lack of comprehension regarding the permanence of the life he had taken or the severity of the consequences he now faced. Sheriff Darrell Dix, who had been vocal throughout the investigation regarding the gang activity fueling the violence, addressed the arrest with a mixture of relief and stern resolve. He confirmed that Kendrick was in custody and emphasized the cooperative effort between the agencies. The sheriff's office released the booking photo, which further cemented the public's perception of the suspect's attitude. In the mugshot, Kendrick stared directly into the lens, the same faint, mocking smile playing on his lips. Following the arrest, the investigation shifted from a manhunt to case building. Detectives executed search warrants on the residence where Kendrick had been hiding. They were looking for the weapon, the modified Glock with the switch. Ballistics matching was critical to link Kendrick definitively to the casings found at Griffin Memorial Stadium. The recovery of the firearm would be the final piece of physical evidence needed to lock down the prosecution's case. Simultaneously, investigators began to piece together the movements of Kendrick during his 8 days as a fugitive. They scrutinized who had provided him with shelter, food, and transportation. The inquiry expanded to include potential charges for those who had harbored him, reinforcing the zero-tolerance stance the sheriff had promised. The interrogation room at the Spalding County Sheriff's Office became the new center of activity. Detectives sought to understand the motive beyond the surface-level gang rivalry. They wanted to know exactly what prompted the decision to introduce automatic gunfire into a high school fistfight. The arrest of Marion Kendrick brought a collective exhale to the city of Griffin, but it provided no closure for the tragedy itself. The legal process was just initiating, and the community was left to grapple with the reality of youth violence that had escalated to military levels. The investigation had been swift and effective, utilizing modern forensics and interagency cooperation to capture a dangerous fugitive in just over a week. Yet, the image of the 17-year-old killer grinning in handcuffs lingered in the public consciousness, a stark symbol of a generation lost to a culture of lethal bravado. The manhunt was over, but the reckoning in the courtroom was yet to come. The justice system now held the burden of addressing the actions of a young man who smiled in the face of murder charges, ensuring that the 8 days of fear would be answered with a lifetime of accountability. The tangible focus of the investigation shifted immediately from the manhunt to the forensic laboratory, where the physical instruments of the crime began to tell a story far more damning than any witness testimony. While the arrest of Marion Kendrick removed a physical threat from the streets of Griffin, the recovery of the weapon provided the mechanical explanation for how a high school rivalry had turned into a scene of carnage. The firearm secured by law enforcement was not merely a standard handgun used for protection or intimidation. It was a modified engine of war, altered to inflict maximum damage in minimum time. The weapon in question was a Glock semi-automatic pistol, a common firearm in both legal ownership and illicit trade due to its reliability and ubiquity. However, The specific model seized from Kendrick's possession had undergone an illegal transformation that fundamentally changed its classification and lethality. Attached to the rear of the slide was a small, innocuous-looking device known colloquially as a switch, or technically as an auto-sear. This aftermarket component, often no larger than a Lego block, bypasses the firearm's internal trigger mechanism. In a standard Glock, one pull of the trigger releases one round. The internal mechanics then reset, requiring the shooter to release and pull the trigger again for the next shot. The switch overrides this disconnector. Forensic analysis confirmed that the device installed on Kendrick's weapon forced the slide to cycle continuously as long as the trigger was depressed. This modification effectively converted the handgun into a fully automatic machine gun, capable of firing its entire magazine in under 2 seconds. The rate of fire for a modified Glock can exceed 1,100 rounds per minute, a speed that renders accurate aiming nearly impossible for an untrained shooter, particularly one firing one-handed while running or in the midst of a chaotic brawl. This technical detail was paramount to the prosecution's evolving theory of the case. It demonstrated that the shooter did not simply fire a warning shot or pick a specific target with precision. Rather, he unleashed a torrent of lead into a crowded space. The presence of the switch spoke to a level of premeditation regarding the capacity for violence. It suggested that the bearer of such a weapon intended not just to defend himself, but to possess the power to overwhelm any opposition with indiscriminate force. Ballistic experts began the meticulous process of matching the shell casings recovered from the asphalt outside Griffin Memorial Stadium to the barrel of the seized gun. The crime scene investigators had cataloged a spray of casings that indicated the shooter had moved while firing, or that the recoil of the automatic weapon had caused the muzzle to climb, scattering the ejected brass in a wide pattern. Microscopic striations on the fired bullets and the distinct firing pin impressions on the primers of the casings provided the fingerprint needed to link the hardware to the homicide. The lab results were conclusive. The casings found near where Emmanuel Dorsey fell had been cycled through the very Glock found in Kendrick's possession. The science bridged the gap between the chaotic eyewitness accounts of the brawl and the cold reality of the murder weapon. While the ballistics team solidified the physical link between Kendrick and the shooting, a different kind of evidence was emerging that would come to define the public and judicial perception of the accused. Following his capture in Henry County after 8 days on the run, Kendrick was transported for processing. It was during these initial moments of custody that the visual narrative of the case took a disturbing turn. As law enforcement officers escorted the 17-year-old suspect, handcuffed and flanked by deputies, cameras captured his demeanor. In a situation where most teenagers would display fear, confusion, or perhaps the stoic blankness of shock, Kendrick offered a different reaction. He grinned. The image was captured in high definition, freezing a moment that seemed to defy the gravity of the charges he faced. It was not a nervous smile or a grimace of discomfort. The expression, later analyzed and debated in the court of public opinion and legal strategy sessions, appeared to be one of amusement or defiance. In the booking photo, the mugshot that would be splashed across news screens and social media feeds, the expression remained. Kendrick looked directly into the lens, the corners of his mouth upturned, his eyes engaging with the camera in a way that suggested a complete detachment from the tragedy of Emmanuel Dorsey's death. This visual evidence became a cornerstone of the narrative regarding Kendrick's character. In the eyes of the investigators and the prosecution, the grin was not just a facial expression, it was an admission of a specific mindset. It argued against remorse. It undermined any potential defense strategy relying on the idea that the shooting was a panicked mistake or a tragic accident born of fear. A person who accidentally kills a 14-year-old boy in a crowded parking lot does not typically smile when the law finally catches up to them. The grinning mugshot became a visceral piece of evidence, a glimpse into the psyche of the accused that no forensic report could quantify. It suggested a hardening, a callousness that aligned with the gang-related motivations the state was preparing to allege. The synergy between the mechanical evidence and the behavioral evidence created a formidable profile. On one hand, there was the modified Glock, a weapon altered to kill indiscriminately, symbolizing a disregard for bystander safety and a desire for lethal dominance. On the other hand, there was the grin, a behavioral cue that seemed to mock the severity of the life taken and the judicial process itself. Together, they painted a portrait of a defendant who was dangerous not just by circumstance, but by nature. As the investigation deepened, digital forensics added another layer to the evidentiary pile. Investigators scrubbed social media accounts and phone data, looking for the digital footprint that often accompanies modern youth violence. The culture of showing off weapons, particularly those with illegal modifications like switches, often leaves a trail of photos and videos. The prosecution sought to establish that the weapon was not a sudden acquisition but a known tool in Kendrick's arsenal, a symbol of status within the cliques that had clashed at the stadium. The grin in the mugshot was not an isolated incident, but potentially consistent with an online persona that glorified violence and defiance of authority. The timeline of the weapon's history was reconstructed. Tracing a firearm with an obliterated serial number or one sold on the black market is difficult, but the modification itself provided leads. The installation of a switch is a federal crime, and the presence of such a device elevated the stakes. It brought federal scrutiny and additional charges into the orbit of the murder case. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, works closely with local agencies in such instances, as the proliferation of these conversion devices has become a priority for law enforcement nationwide. For the prosecution, the federal illegality of the weapon was a powerful aggravator. It stripped away the veneer of a scared kid with a gun and replaced it with the image of a criminal carrying a prohibited machine gun. The evidentiary phase also focused on the immediate aftermath of the shooting, as recorded by surveillance systems in the vicinity of Griffin Memorial Stadium. While the fight itself was chaotic, the audio captured by nearby security cameras provided a terrifying auditory signature. The distinct sound of automatic gunfire, a rapid, continuous burp of noise rather than distinct, rhythmic shots corroborated the forensic findings of the switch. Witnesses who had been present described a sound like firecrackers or a jackhammer, a sensory detail that locked into place with the physical capability of the seized Glock. This audio evidence would serve to immerse a jury in the terror of the moment, proving that the danger presented by Kendrick was distinct from the general shouting and shoving of the school rivalry. Furthermore, the clothing seized from Kendrick at the time of his arrest and the clothes identified in videos from the night of the murder were analyzed for gunshot residue. The presence of microscopic particles containing lead, barium, and antimony on the garments worn by the suspect would place him not just at the scene, but in the immediate vicinity of a discharging firearm. While the 8-day gap between the crime and the arrest allowed for the potential disposal or cleaning of evidence, the transfer of residue is persistent. Items recovered from his hideout or associated with his flight were subjected to chemical testing to track the invisible dust of the explosion. The grin, however, remained the most haunting artifact. It became a focal point for the community's outrage. In the days following the release of the photo, the image was shared thousands of times, becoming a symbol of the senselessness of the violence that had claimed Emmanuel Dorsey. For the victim's family, the image was a source of profound pain, interpreted as a final insult to the life of the 14-year-old student. For the defense, it was a catastrophic optic, a piece of prejudice that would be difficult to unseat from the minds of potential jurors. They would have to argue that a facial expression is not a confession, that nervousness can manifest in strange ways, or that the smile was a facade of bravado masking terror. But combined with the lethal mechanics of the modified gun, the smile looked less like a mask and more like a true face. As the detective work concluded, and the case moved toward the pretrial motions, the weight of the evidence was clear. The state had the how in the form of the machine gun-capable pistol. They had the who via ballistics and identification. And in the grinning mugshot, they believed they had a glimpse of the why, a chilling indifference to human life. The juxtaposition of a 14-year-old victim, dead on the pavement, and a 17-year-old shooter, smiling in police custody, created a narrative of moral void that the prosecution intended to exploit to its fullest extent. The switch turned the gun into a weapon of war, The grin turned the suspect into a villain. The stage was set for a courtroom confrontation, where these silent pieces of evidence would speak louder than any opening statement. The technical specifications of a modified seer and the pixels of a digital photograph were about to determine the fate of Keomarion Kendrick, ensuring that his brief moment of lethal power would be answered by a lifetime of confinement. The legal proceedings against Keomarion LaShawn Kendrick formally commenced in the Spalding County Superior Court, marking the final phase of a tragedy that had begun outside Griffin Memorial Stadium. By the time the trial date arrived in January 2026, the community of Griffin, Georgia, had spent over 2 years waiting for a judicial resolution to the shooting that claimed the life of 14-year-old Emmanuel Dorsey. The atmosphere inside the courthouse was heavy, characterized by a palpable tension between the families involved and a heavy law enforcement presence, a necessity given the gang-related undercurrents of the case. The prosecution, led by the Spalding County District Attorney's Office, prepared to present a case that went beyond a singular act of violence, framing the murder as a symptom of a broader, systemic issue involving street gangs and the proliferation of modified firearms. Jury selection proved to be a meticulous process. The notoriety of the case, amplified by the widely circulated image of Kendrick smiling during his initial transport, required the court to filter through potential jurors to find those who could set aside their preconceptions. The defense sought to ensure that Kendrick, who was 17 at the time of the offense, was tried on the facts of the night in question rather than his public persona or the chilling optics of his arrest. Once the 12 jurors were seated and sworn in, the state began to dismantle the presumption of innocence with a methodical presentation of forensic and testimonial evidence. The prosecution's opening strategy hinged on the timeline and the weapon. They argued that the shooting was not a random outbreak of chaos, but a specific, calculated act of aggression exacerbated by gang affiliations. The indictment against Kendrick was extensive. He faced charges of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, and crucially, multiple counts of violating the Georgia Street Gang Terrorism and Prevention Act. This racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, or RICO, component allowed the state to introduce evidence of Kendrick's associations, arguing that the violence outside the stadium was committed to maintain or increase his status within a criminal organization. A focal point of the evidentiary phase was the weapon itself. Forensic firearms experts took the stand to explain the mechanics of the modified Glock recovered during the investigation. They detailed how the installation of a machine gun conversion device, commonly known as a switch, fundamentally altered the nature of the firearm. The jury was shown how this small, illegal component bypassed the semi-automatic trigger mechanism, allowing the weapon to fire continuously with a single pull of the trigger. This technical testimony was vital to the aggravated assault charges. By firing a weapon capable of such rapid discharge into a crowd of students and families leaving a football game, the state argued that Kendrick displayed an abandoned and malignant heart, a legal standard necessary for a murder conviction in Georgia. The dispersion of the shell casings at the scene corroborated the erratic and devastating potential of the modified gun. Witness testimony reconstructed the panic of the 30th of September 2023. Bystanders described the brawl that precipitated the gunfire, noting the distinct shift in the atmosphere when the weapon was produced. The state played surveillance footage and utilized digital reconstructions to place Kendrick at the specific vantage point from which the fatal shots were fired. While the defense attempted to cast doubt on the identity of the shooter amidst the chaotic melee of the brawl, the prosecution countered with ballistics evidence linking the casing found near Dorsey's body to the firearm linked to Kendrick. The narrative established by the state was one of indiscriminate power. The shooter did not care who he hit, only that he demonstrated dominance. The gang charges added a layer of complexity and severity to the proceedings. Under Georgia's strict anti-gang statutes, the prosecution introduced social media records and communication logs to establish Kendrick's affiliation. They argued that the rivalry between the cliques involved in the brawl was not merely a schoolyard dispute, but a proxy war between established street gangs. By connecting the murder of Emmanuel Dorsey to this larger criminal enterprise, the state sought to ensure that the sentencing, should a conviction be secured, would reflect the organized nature of the violence. This strategy also served to contextualize the grinning mugshot, which the prosecution subtly alluded to as a display of bravado typical of gang culture, rather than a mere reaction to nervous shock. As the trial moved to closing arguments, the defense made a final plea, focusing on Kendrick's age and the chaotic nature of the environment that night. They argued for a distinction between a panicked reaction by a teenager and a premeditated act of malice. However, the state returned to the image of Emmanuel Dorsey, a 14-year-old middle school student who had simply attended a football game. They juxtaposed the innocence of the victim with the lethality of the perpetrator's choices, the choice to carry a gun, the choice to modify it for maximum damage, and the choice to pull the trigger in a crowded public space. The jury's deliberation was relatively swift, reflecting the overwhelming weight of the physical and digital evidence. On a cold day in late January 2026, the foreperson read the verdict. K.O. Marion LaShawn Kendrick was found guilty on all counts. The clerk recited the findings: guilty of malice murder, guilty of felony murder, guilty of multiple counts of aggravated assault representing the other lives endangered in the crowd, guilty of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, guilty of violation of the Street Gang Terrorism and Prevention Act. The conviction on malice murder was particularly significant, as it indicated the jury believed Kendrick acted with an express or implied intent to kill, rather than just acting recklessly. The transition from verdict to sentencing was immediate in its gravity. The sentencing hearing was held shortly after the conviction, presided over by Judge Benjamin D. Coker. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with the emotional exhaust of the trial. Victim impact statements were presented, providing the court with a glimpse into the void left by Emmanuel Dorsey's death. Family members spoke of a life cut short, of a future stolen, and of the permanent silence in a home that once held a vibrant 14-year-old boy. These statements served as the emotional anchor for the prosecution's request for the maximum possible penalty. The prosecution argued that Kendrick's lack of remorse, evidenced by his post-arrest demeanor and the nature of the crime, required a sentence that ensured he would never threaten the community again. They highlighted the use of the machine gun switch as an aggravating factor, distinguishing this case from a typical second-degree homicide. The state requested that the sentences for the additional crimes, the gang activity, the assaults on the bystanders, and the weapons charges run consecutively to the murder sentence rather than concurrently. This legal distinction was the difference between a life sentence with a theoretical chance of release and a guarantee of dying in prison. Judge Benjamin D. Coker, having heard the evidence and the pleas of the bereaved, delivered the sentence with a stern adherence to the statutes designed to curb youth violence and gang activity. He addressed the defendant, noting the tragedy of 2 young lives destroyed, one buried and one about to be buried within the corrections system. However, the judge emphasized that the court's primary duty was the protection of society and the delivery of justice for Emmanuel Dorsey. The sentence handed down was absolute. For the charge of malice murder, K.O. Marion Kendrick was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In Georgia, this sentence means exactly what it says. There is no review board, no hearing after 30 years, and no avenue for release. But the judge did not stop there. Addressing the additional counts, Judge Coker systematically added time for each offense. For the violations of the Street Gang Terrorism and Prevention Act, the judge imposed significant prison terms, citing the need to deter organized criminal activity in Spalding County. For the aggravated assault charges, representing the danger posed to the crowd by the spray of automatic fire, consecutive sentences were applied. For the possession of the machine gun-capable firearm, further years were added. When the clerk tallied the consecutive terms, the total addition to the life sentence was 85 years. The final pronouncement was life without parole, plus 85 years. The plus 85 years served a dual purpose. Legally, it acted as an insurance policy against any future changes to parole laws or appellate reductions regarding the murder charge. If, hypothetically, the life without parole sentence were ever commuted or modified, the 85-year consecutive term would immediately take effect, ensuring Kendrick would still remain incarcerated well beyond a natural human lifespan. Symbolically, the sentence was a message to the community and to other youths involved in gang activity. It quantified the severity of the extra crimes, the gang participation, and the reckless endangerment, making it clear that these were not merely incidental to the murder, but serious felonies in their own right. Kendrick, now 20 years old at the time of sentencing, stood to receive the judgment that would define the remainder of his existence. The smile that had made headlines years prior was absent. The reality of the RICO charges and the machine gun enhancement had effectively closed the book on his life in the free world. The legal outcome was a definitive condemnation of the culture of violence that had turned a high school football rivalry into a deadly shootout. As the deputies prepared to remand him to the Georgia Department of Corrections to begin his term, the court adjourned. The legal narrative of Keomarion Kendrick concluded not with a question mark, but with a period. The justice system had processed the evidence, from the modified Glock to the grinning mugshot, and returned a verdict intended to match the finality of death. Emmanuel Dorsey's family left the courthouse with the legal resolution they had sought, though it did nothing to reverse the loss of the 30th of September 2023. The sentence of life plus 85 years stood as a monument to the consequences of pulling a trigger in Spalding County, a stark legal epilogue to a night of senseless violence. The gavel falling on the final sentence of life without parole plus 85 years marked the end of the legal proceedings, but it signaled the beginning of a long, quiet endurement for those left in the wake of the violence. As Keomarion Kendrick was transported away to vanish into the penitentiary system, the city of Griffin, Georgia, was left to reckon with the crater left by the events of the 30th of September 2023. The judicial system had done its work, extracting the perpetrator from society, yet the mechanism of justice possesses no capacity to reverse time or resurrect the dead. The legacy of the shooting at Griffin Memorial Stadium became a permanent scar on the community, fundamentally altering the way the residents viewed their public spaces, their youth, and their safety. For the family of Emmanuel Dorsey, the conclusion of the trial did not bring closure, a concept often cited by observers but rarely felt by survivors. Instead, it brought a transition from the frenetic energy of investigation and litigation to the static reality of permanent absence. Emmanuel was 14 years old when he died. He was a freshman, standing on the precipice of adulthood, a phase of life defined by potential. The legacy he leaves is composed of the milestones he will never reach. There will be no 16th birthday, no driver's license, no high school graduation, and no career. The sentence handed down to Kendrick ensures that the killer will grow old within concrete walls, but it does not grant Emmanuel the opportunity to grow old at all. The silence in the Dorsey home remains the loudest testament to the crime. The impact rippled outward from the immediate family to the student body of the Griffin-Spalding County school system. The murder occurred after the Battle of the Birds, the historic football rivalry between Griffin High School and Spalding High School. For generations, this game served as a cornerstone of community pride, a singular event where the town gathered to celebrate tradition and sport. The shooting dismantled that sense of sanctuary. The stadium, once a neutral ground for spirited competition, became a crime scene. In the months and years following the murder, the atmosphere surrounding high school athletics in Spalding County shifted from celebration to high-alert vigilance. Administrators and law enforcement were forced to overhaul security protocols. The sight of heightened police presence, weapon detection systems, and clear bag policies became the new standard for Friday night lights. The innocence of the fanfare was replaced by a grim pragmatism. Parents who once dropped their children off at the gate with a wave now hesitated, forced to weigh the cultural importance of the game against the very real possibility of gun violence. The shooting stole the carefree nature of adolescence from thousands of students, teaching them that a football game could devolve into a tactical environment in seconds. The trauma inflicted upon the witnesses, teenagers who watched a peer die on the pavement while scrambling for cover, required counseling and support resources that stretched the district's capabilities. The case also left a distinct legacy regarding the proliferation of illegal firearm modifications in rural and suburban Georgia. The evidence presented during the trial regarding the switch, attached to Kendrick's Glock, highlighted a terrifying escalation in youth violence. The investigation revealed that this was not merely a fistfight that went wrong, but a calculated deployment of military-grade firepower in a civilian setting. The conviction of Kendrick served as a severe warning from the judicial bench regarding the possession and use of machine gun conversion devices. Local law enforcement agencies used the tragedy as a grim case study in their community outreach, trying to impress upon the youth that the possession of such devices leads inextricably to two outcomes: death or a life sentence. The cool factor or status associated with these weapons was dismantled in the courtroom, replaced by the reality of shackles and prison transport vans. However, the sociological wounds ran deeper than security logistics. The motive for the shooting, a conflict between rival cliques, forced the community to confront the undercurrents of gang culture percolating within the student population. The tragedy prompted town hall meetings and task forces aimed at violence intervention. Pastors, civic leaders, and educators sought to understand how a rivalry between schools had metastasized into lethal factionalism. The grinning mugshot of Marion Kendrick became a polarizing symbol in these discussions. To some, it represented a sociopathic detachment that necessitated the harshest possible punishment. To others, it was a mask of bravado worn by a lost young man, indicative of a broader systemic failure to intervene before a teenager felt compelled to carry a machine gun to a football game. The legal resolution of the case also solidified the narrative of two wasted lives, though the distinction between them remains absolute. Kendrick's life is wasted by his own choices. Dorsey's life was stolen. The 85 years added to the life sentence served as a symbolic accounting for the terror inflicted on the other victims in the crowd and the assault on the peace of the community, but the core of the tragedy remains the 14-year-old boy who never made it home. As time moves forward, the yellow crime scene tape has long been removed from the vicinity of Griffin Memorial Stadium. The crowds have returned, and the games continue, because life in a small town must sustain itself. But the memory of that September night persists. It is found in the memorial plaques, the empty seat at the graduation ceremony that would have been Emmanuel's, and the enduring grief of a mother who lost her son to a senseless pull of a trigger. The case of Marion Kendrick is cited in legal textbooks and news archives as a victory for the prosecution and a firm stance against gang violence. But in the quiet neighborhoods of Griffin, the case is remembered not for the sentence delivered, but for the boy taken. The grin that once flashed across news screens has faded into the obscurity of the prison system, leaving behind only the solemn, permanent memory of Emmanuel Dorsey,